politician, which may mean precarious things career-wise, but it means at least I don't have to ever be politically correct, and I hope I won't be today. I'm going to take my text from Alice in Wonderland, which is one of the best texts to understand what's happening in Europe at the moment. And you'll all remember the conversation between Alice and the White Queen, when the White Queen tries to urge Alice to practice thinking of impossible things. And Alice says, one can't think of impossible things. And the White Queen says, nonsense. When I was your age, I used to spend at least half an hour a morning thinking impossible things. Why, I used to be able to think of at least 6 impossible things before breakfast. Well, Europeans are expected to think far more than 6 impossible things before breakfast these days, and I could be here all day if I wanted to list all of the impossible things that you and I are expected to believe. But let me just go over 4 of the impossible things which we're meant to believe, and I'll do them as briefly as I can. The first of the impossible things which we're asked to believe is that Islam is a peaceful religion. It's very evidently not. No religion is entirely peaceful, but Islam is especially not peaceful. We are, of course, always reminded that there is a problem of authority within Islam, and that is certainly true. But it also means that the sources matter even more than those of any other religion, because it means that the source is what you have to go on. It means that the source will most likely always trump any organization or any individual who claims to speak for the religion more than the sources. That's why, as the professor said at the beginning, the life of Muhammad is so important if one is going to understand this. And as the professor said, when Muhammad was weak, he was more generous. When he was strong, that generosity palpably, visibly declined somewhat. And we see a similar thing in the world today, and we see a similar thing, I would argue, not only in Islamic societies, but within Islamic communities in European societies. When Islam is in a minority, it speaks a very great deal about minority rights. We cannot help noticing that when Islam is in a majority, or at least in a position to rule, those minority rights go out of the window. Minority rights of sexual minorities, the minority rights of religious minorities, and so on. The problem, which this boils down to, I'll be as brief as possible on it, is that Europeans cannot accept the fact that what ISIS and other terrorists do is very obviously the worst possible interpretation of Islam. It is obviously the worst possible interpretation of Islam for Muslims worldwide, and it is obviously the very worst version of Islam possible for non-Muslims worldwide. Nevertheless, it is a plausible interpretation of the texts in front of them and the tradition from which they come. And if you doubt that, I would urge you to consider one particular source, which if there is an authority within the Muslim world you might turn to, and that is the University of Al-Azhar in Cairo. And I'm very sorry that both the Egyptian ambassador and also our friend from the Fatwa Council are absent now. But if you look at what happened last December, a year ago, a young Jordanian pilot shot down over ISIS-controlled territory. And you'll remember that he was burned alive brutally by the maniacs of ISIS. That young man was a Muslim himself, and the people of ISIS claimed to be acting in the name of Islam as well. Al-Azhar in Cairo had an extraordinary debate about this, one aspect of which was this, that the senior clerics said that what had happened should be punished, that the people who did that and burned that brave young Muslim Jordanian pilot should be punished. They should be punished, incidentally, by either being crucified or by having alternate legs and arms cut off. This was because they had broken the Islamic prohibition on the desecration of a body. You might think that crucifixion somewhat broke that prohibition as well. But they also said, very strikingly, that the thing to bear in mind about ISIS was that they were indeed terrorists, they were indeed extremists, but, quote, not to be described as heretics. Just a couple of days ago, one of very distinguished scholars, graduates of Al-Azhar, Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah Nasra, gave a televised interview in which he was asked why Al-Azhar is in the habit of denouncing secular thinkers as un-Islamic, but refuses to denounce the Islamic State as un-Islamic. And Sheikh Nasra said, quote, Al-Azhar, can't condemn the Islamic State as un-Islamic. The Islamic State is a byproduct of Al-Azhar's programs. So how can Al-Azhar denounce itself as un-Islamic? This, I simply present it as, is a very significant problem. Nevertheless, we are invited to believe the impossible and to believe every day before breakfast that Islam is a religion of peace and that there's nothing else to see. The second thing we're invited to believe that is obviously impossible is that multiculturalism works. Now, it's a very striking thing that 5 years ago, as Daniel Johnson referred to, Angela Merkel said that multiculturalism had failed. 4 years ago, President Sarkozy and Prime Minister Cameron also said that multiculturalism had failed. Yet we as Europeans are invited to believe that when migration was at a relative low point, multiculturalism had failed, whereas when migration was at such a historic high as it currently is, it could possibly work. This is a very impossible thing to believe. We're also invited to believe that the numbers don't matter, that the quantity of people coming in would not in any way particularly affect your society. There is a figure that I can't help trotting out on such occasions when I hear such things. We are often told in Britain, and I know across Europe people are told, that we are all migrant societies. This is not true. It is a bit of casuistry we've been invited to engage in. But it is true that we have had immigration throughout our history. But if you consider that the largest migration that people still speak about in Britain over recent centuries was 4 centuries ago, when in 1683, in the aftermath of 1683, more than 50,000 Huguenots, French Protestants, came to the United Kingdom. Such a large migration that people still talk about it. From 1997 onwards, 50,000 immigrants was about 6 weeks of average immigration into the UK. So the numbers clearly do matter in some way, and they obviously matter as well because of a density question. Nobody in any of our countries has worked out what to do about, as it were, dispersing people who arrive in such large numbers. And the result, in different ways, in Paris, in Germany, and in England and elsewhere, is you effectively get ghettos. These ghettos have all sorts of negative things to do with them, but one which is not noted enough, I would say, but I would give one figure to you that may be relevant, is the extent to which they can cause radicalization themselves. If you go through the figures that my think tank has produced, from every single person convicted, not suspected, but convicted of terrorism-related offences in the UK, 9 out of 10 of those people who have been convicted of Islamic terrorism offences come from areas where the population is between 25 and 50% Muslim. That is around 7 to 10 times the national average. That is not a coincidence. It is a byproduct of a density of population. We're also, the fourth impossible thing we're invited to believe is that the identity of immigrants into our societies does not matter. Now, in the UK, in the wake of the atrocities in January in Paris, a poll was conducted of British Muslims, which found that 27% of British Muslims had some sympathy with the people who had gone into the offices of Charlie Hebdo and massacred 10 journalists and 2 policemen. They had some sympathy with that. Now, when I was in Denmark a few months ago speaking at the Parliament for the 10th anniversary of the Danish cartoons affair, I was very struck by speaking to a Danish politician who said that she didn't want any more Muslim immigrants in Denmark. And I said, are you sure? That's a somewhat clear, but arguably too clear policy. She said, no, why should we? Because for every 100 immigrants we bring in, there will be at least 70 who don't believe we should publish cartoons and want to limit what we say and speak about and what we publish in our newspapers. And it's a difficult argument to refute. Angela Merkel, I gather in recent days, has been in touch with the Israeli government to try to find out how the Israelis absorbed so many people into their society so successfully in recent decades. Of course, one of the reasons why they've been able to do that is because the people coming to Israel are Jewish. It may well come as a great shock to Angela Merkel that the 1 million people she's let into her country this year are not all German Lutherans. But if...
You would think these politicians after a while would learn, but the problem is these politicians they're globalists. They're looking to do open borders for the most of them. They want to have multiculturalism as a part of their policies across Western Europe, across the Americas. I mean, this is what they're looking for. This is where they gain their strength in terms of popularity, obviously amongst the left, the progressives, the liberals, the far left, right? This is what's happening. I mean, you think Angela Merkel doesn't realize that the millions of people that she's brought in she doesn't realize they're not of German ancestry? That's news to her. She actually had to ask the question of the Israelis as what did you do to assimilate? The people that were coming to Israel are Jewish, you stupid moron. Angela Merkel, what an idiot. The same thing happens. It's like Douglas was saying, that when you have that many people coming from across the world, and the majority that are coming, they're not Christians that are coming to a Judeo-Christian nation. The majority of people that are coming to the United Kingdom, they're not Christian, they're not Jewish, they're not Protestant, they're not Catholic. Most of them that are coming of an Islamic faith. And the problem that's happening is that they're not assimilating, they're not integrating. That's not what's happening. They're going into, just like he was saying, the ghettoization. And that's because, first of all, you got small land masses. The difference between England and America, well, first of all, we're not getting the kinds of waves of immigrant. Now, what's happening on us is the southern border is that the people that are coming, well, you know what? They probably are coming as Catholics and Christians coming across the southern border. But again, it's a completely different ethnic grouping. This is not white Europeans that are coming across the southern border. These are Hispanics, Mexicans, Guatemalans, Nicaraguans, Costa Rica. I mean, that's where they're coming from. That's just who they are. That's fine. If they were coming across the northern border, you'd probably say they're Canadians or French Canadians, they're coming down. But that's not happening, that much on our northern border. But on the southern border, that's what's happening. Different culture, different language. And then again, the difference between Spanish, difference between, Latin American, difference between Nicaraguan, Salvadorians, Ecuadorians. I mean, right? There's a whole difference. So the same things happen. So of course, it's going to be hard. But the thing is, there's ghettoizations that are occurring here too. But that's among what? The Hispanic, the Latin community. They're gravitating. They're going to what they call sanctuary cities, which are nothing. Basically, what they are is what happening is a ghettoization of that's occurring. And look at the problems that's happening just on a small level. I mean, it's a huge level, but not like what's happening in Europe. Look what's happening. The mayors are crying now, all because some of the southern governors or western governors that have been at the forefront of this huge migration influx, illegal alien influx in the United States of America, they decided to bus a few bus loads and fly a few plane loads of illegals and migrants up into, New York, Chicago, Detroit, some of these other cities, and all of a sudden now New York City can't handle it. Chicago can't handle it. And the problems that are occurring there, hotels are being used to migrant. They're taking students out of schools, use the schools to house migrants. They're getting rid of people that are on the street. They're getting rid of, homes, halfway homes, and other, units that were basically utilized for homeless people, shelters, and they're now using those for migrants over U.S. citizens. This whole thing is happening because we talk about the non-assimilation, especially amongst those that are coming, from some of these Muslim countries that are coming into England. 25, 30, 40, 50, 60%, Leeds, Birmingham, London. You know what we're talking about. And yes, that's exactly where this type of, indoctrination or the Islamism, the indoctrination into, some type of extremism, could occur and has occurred, as Douglas pointed out. You've got to be able to disperse the populations. And the other thing is, the majority are coming as uneducated. Uneducated. These are not doctors and lawyers and whatever. And I'm not speaking, these are not your best and brightest that are coming from these countries. They're not. And that has nothing, there is a difference between the educated and the people that are less educated. People that have a trade that they were doing, and those that have absolutely no tradable skills whatsoever. Manual labor. How many jobs, how many can you skillfully employ? And in what areas? Where are they going to go? These are the questions that are trying to be answered, but they're not, and the problems are occurring. Anyways, let's get back to more of the interview and the doc with Douglas Murray.
Most people do now, that there is at least a proportion of this community, and we must always remember only a proportion, not a majority, but a proportion of this community that is a problem. Let's go to the lowest possible proportion. Let's pretend that only 1% of that community has any bad ideas or bad intent towards our society. Let's just pretend 1%. Nobody can tell us why 1% of, say, 2 million people is a problem, but 1% of 4 million or 5 million people is not. This is an impossible thing. So we're asked to fib ourselves. We console ourselves with lies. We have been in Europe rewriting, among other things, our past. At any historical discussion now, anywhere in Europe, there is always somebody who raises, quite often, quite a lot of people who raise, for instance, the issue of the Islamic Neoplatonists, a very interesting corner of history. But this now bears an unbelievable load historically. People argue that the Islamic Neoplatonists are what we owe our entire civilization to, that we would be in the Dark Ages if it weren't for the Islamic Neoplatonists. At a recent event at the European Parliament I was speaking at, one of the members of the European Commission waved a copy of a book called 1001 Islamic Inventions. This, he doesn't know, is an act of dawah by the Muslim Brotherhood. But in any case, he waved this book, 1001 Islamic Inventions, which has toured the world, went even to the Science Museum in Britain, the exhibition of the book, and it's entirely fictional. But it's consoling to us. It says that Islam invented almost everything in the world. It invented cities, it invented agriculture, it invented free thought. It even says at one point that Muhammad invented the toothbrush. I'm never quite sure why they need to throw that one in. But it basically says it rewrites our societies. It rewrites our societies in an Islamic slant so that we actually owe our society to Islam. This is a lie we tell ourselves simply in order to try to get by in the situation created for us by our politicians. We then also pretend to ourselves that our values are shared by everyone, when anybody who speaks to any arrival from the Middle East will know, anybody in the Middle East will know that clearly many things, as Daniel Johnson again said, that we take for granted in Europe are most certainly not taken for granted by people in the Middle East, or let alone from sub-Saharan Africa, where such a large number of the migrants now come from. But we also fib ourselves by trying to change our present. One of the bits of casuistry which a lot of particularly secular thinkers do at the moment is to say after, for instance, a terrorist assault like that in Paris the other week, that the response must be that we abandon all faith schools, for instance. That in response to a terrorist atrocity, we must attack all religion, or deracinate a religious identity from the religious square. This is a very perverse way of ignoring a problem. It means that after somebody goes into a theatre in Paris with Kalashnikovs and suicide belts, you should shut Anglican state schools in the UK. This makes absolutely no sense. It makes no sense to strip ourselves of our own identity in response to a clear terrorist threat. The other option, of course, is that we give up some of our rights. I was disturbed to hear the references earlier to Charlie Hebdo and the references to these cartoons as abusive and primitive. Abusive and primitive cartoons are something that are published every single day in all of the press. I'm sure that your Prime Minister here can tell us something about abusive cartoons. Certainly the Prime Ministers in France, Britain, and elsewhere can. Abusive cartoons and abusive speech is protected. It is a right. It is something we can do, partly because such speech is often correct. But we volunteer to give up a bit of that. We will, for instance, critique all religions bravely, but not Islam. This is a very great mistake. And the other thing we do, of course, is that we give excuses to the extremists which they never even asked for. Somebody referred earlier to the risk of a lack of opportunity. Take the Zarnaev brothers, the two brothers originally from Dagestan who went to America with their family 20 years ago. They were given absolutely everything as asylum seekers and as refugees by America. They were given their education, they were given their housing, they were given allowances, they went to university, but they put bombs at the finish line of the Boston Marathon. There was no lack of opportunity, no lack of generosity, no cold-heartedness. It was something quite different. I'm going to wrap up by saying that, by the way, not a day goes by where you can't also at least have a grim laugh about this. Today, it was provided once again by Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Defense Minister, Mohammed bin Salman, this morning announced a 34-country anti-terror coalition that he was helping to put together. And he announced this. It's very unclear what it actually consists of. He announced this by saying, quote, "Currently, every Muslim country is fighting terrorism individually, so coordinating is very important." It really does require a heart of stone not to laugh. If the Saudi government wants to find the causes of extremism, it can find them in its own house and palaces. It doesn't need to look around the world for them. So what do we do? Very quickly, 5 things. The first is, I think, to acknowledge that mass migration of the scale we've seen in recent years has been a great mistake. It has been a historic mistake, and we are still dealing with the consequences of it. The second thing would be to stop the mass migration. That isn't to say stop all immigration, but to stop the mass migration, which is going on at the moment. A third is to acknowledge that the Muslim world is going through a civil war. It's an extremely complex civil war, and it's possible, very likely, it will outlive all of us. But therefore, it's very important that we try to any extent we can, protect ourselves from it, to shield ourselves from it, and to try to hold it off in order that our own societies do not become completely absorbed by that civil war. We try to absorb, fourthly, those people who are already here, and fifthly, we try, as somebody said earlier, to reconstruct our own societies. After decades of deconstruction from the academies and elsewhere, to reconstruct our societies, and to say we do not have to rewrite our past and our present. We do not have to be made to think impossible things. There are many, many things which we should be thinking about, and many, many good things we have that we would like to keep them, and that there is nothing wrong about saying so. Thank you. That politicians have all tried.
Those are some great points that Douglas put out there at the very end. You know, mass immigration. No country is going to be able to absorb at the levels that they're talking about. And each country has to determine what its levels and its capacity is. And that globalization, open borders is not the key. Multiculturalism is not the key. All they have to do is just look at history. History will tell you what you need to see, where the mistakes were made, so that those mistakes don't continue to be made. We're not saying, as Douglas was saying, is to stop migration, but at least have at least a plan. A great thing would be meritocracy. What is it that the society needs? Is there a need for a certain, let's say, let's say the policy is we want to help the world. But you can't help the world all at once. But maybe you set up a policy and say, you know what, we're going to have a commission drawn up, see which group of people around the world need the most help. And if our policy is to bring some of them in, that might be something, I don't know. That might be a start. Or it might be based on meritocracy, a point system. And you have a certain amount of people that you're going to pick from different parts of the world, different countries. Or it could be simply you take a look, where are you deficient in terms of what are the needs of the nation? Is there a shortage of some type of work, a trade, a profession that you just can't? You're dealing with a really severe shortage in that, and you need to bolster that. That needs to be there, done for society. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, scientists, whatever, teachers. That would be a way of doing it. But just to basically say multiculturalism, anybody come on over, that is not going to work. And it's been shown that it has not worked. And that Western Europe and other countries, including the United States of America, including Canada, including Australia, you name the first world countries, there are huge, huge problems that are occurring with the mass migration movement of people in terms of ethnicities, in terms of culture, in terms of different religious, in terms of differences all across the board. Anyways, folks, we appreciate you taking the time to watch. You've been watching the Dr. Nasser Sheikh Show. If you haven't done so already, we'd love for you to subscribe to the channel, like, share, and follow us. You know what you need to do. Come on. Take a look at our other video content above and below. My final thought is always, when you're right, you're right, and when you're left, you're wrong. Until next time, folks, take care and stay safe.